Margaret Tillis didn't wait for the meeting to officially begin. She stood up before the chairman could even call the room to order, smoothed the front of her navy dress with both palms, and raised her voice so every person packed into that stuffy hall could hear her clearly. "I've already spoken with 3 families from Millbrook," she announced. "They confirmed it. This woman abandoned her students without a word of notice, walked out midterm and left 30 children with no one." She let that settle, then added, quieter, almost gentle, "We owe it to the children of Red Hollow to ask, what kind of teacher does that?" The room shifted, heads turned, and Adeline Mercer, still standing near the back door with her traveling trunk at her feet, and dust from the road still on her boots, felt the air go out of her lungs like she'd been struck. She had arrived 3 hours ago. She hadn't even found a place to sleep yet. If this story already has your heart, hit that like button. Drop your city and country in the comments so I can see how far this story travels. And subscribe so you don't miss what happens next. Stories like this one don't come around often, and I promise you, this is only the beginning. The wagon that brought Adeline Mercer into Red Hollow arrived just after noon on a Tuesday in late September, and the driver, a heavy-set man named Bart, who smelled of pipe tobacco and wet wool, hadn't said more than 12 words to her the entire journey from the rail station at Dunmore. That suited her fine. She wasn't feeling talkative. She had her trunk, her satchel, a small tin box that held her teaching certificates and the letter of appointment from the Red Hollow School Board, and the particular brand of exhaustion that comes not from traveling, but from everything that happened before the traveling. 6 months of watching her father decline. 3 months at his bedside while the world outside continued on without her. 2 months after his death spent trying to settle his affairs, sell the house, pay his debts with what little remained, and figure out what came next. What came next was a letter from a school board 400 miles away, offering her a position teaching the upper grades. She had written back the same day she received it. Red Hollow sat in a wide valley with timber hills to the north and flat grazing land stretching south toward a river she couldn't see yet. The main street was maybe 5 blocks of storefronts and residences, a water trough at one end, a livery at the other, a church with a weather-stained steeple, a hotel that looked respectable enough, 2 saloons that didn't. And at the far end of the street she could see the schoolhouse, white-clapboard, a bell mounted above the door, a yard enclosed with a low fence. It looked exactly the way she'd imagined it. Bart helped her trunk down from the wagon bed without comment and drove off before she'd taken 20 steps toward the hotel. She stood a moment on the planked sidewalk, satchel over one shoulder, and breathed in the smell of the place. Sawdust and horse, and something faintly metallic from somewhere down the block. A forge, probably. 3 women passed her on the sidewalk. One of them glanced at her luggage label, then at her face, then looked away without speaking. Adeline thought nothing of it. Small towns always needed a moment to adjust to a stranger. She was wrong about that being a small thing. The hotel clerk, a young man with a prominent Adam's apple and the distracted air of someone thinking about his supper, started to hand her a room key, then paused. "You're the new school teacher?" he said. "I am," she said. "Adeline Mercer. I have an appointment with the school board this afternoon." Something moved across his face. Not hostility exactly, more like discomfort, the look of a person who knows something unflattering and isn't sure whether to share it. "Meeting's been moved up," he said finally. "It's tonight, not Thursday. Word went around this morning." He set the key on the counter, but didn't quite let go of it. "Ms. Tillis came through about an hour ago. She had things to say." "Mrs. Tillis," Adeline repeated. "She runs the primary school. Been here 11 years. He finally released the key. "3rd floor, room 8. Stairs around the corner." He paused again, then added, so quietly she almost missed it. "I'd go to that meeting if I were you. Go early." She went. She didn't even unpack first. The meeting hall was attached to the back of the feed store. A long room with benches on both sides, and a raised table at the far end where the 5 board members sat in a row. It was already half full when Adeline arrived, which surprised her. She hadn't expected the community at large to attend a routine school board appointment, but the benches kept filling up, people settling in with the particular purposefulness of an audience expecting a show. She recognized the signs. She'd seen it before, in smaller ways in the 2 other towns where she'd taught, but never quite like this. She found a seat near the back, Her trunk was at the hotel. Her letter of appointment was in her satchel. She pressed her hand against it through the leather and told herself it would be fine. Then Margaret Tillis stood up before the chairman could call the room to order. She was a tall woman, perhaps 50, with iron gray hair pinned so tightly it seemed to pull the skin of her temples. She wore a brooch at her collar that caught the lamplight when she moved. And when she spoke, the whole room went quiet without her having to ask, the way rooms do for people who have spent years making themselves the center of them. "I've already spoken with 3 families from Millbrook," she announced. They confirmed it. This woman abandoned her students without a word of notice. Walked out midterm and left 30 children with no one. She paused. "We owe it to the children of Red Hollow to ask, what kind of teacher does that?" Someone toward the front murmured something that sounded like agreement. A man near Adeline shifted on the bench and looked at her sideways. Adeline's hands went flat on her thighs. She kept her face even. The chairman, a red-faced man named Harold Price, who she'd only seen once in a letter signature, cleared his throat. "This is exactly the kind of concern the board takes seriously," he said, which told her almost everything she needed to know about where this was going. "I'd like to speak," Adeline said. She hadn't meant to say it yet. She'd meant to wait, to let them finish, to respond carefully and with documentation. But the words came out, and the room turned to look at her. She stood up. "My name is Adeline Mercer," she said. "I was contracted by the Red Hollow School Board on the 14th of March to fill the position of upper grade instructor. I have the signed letter with me." She reached into her satchel and held it up, not to wave it around, but just so they could see it existed. "I also have a letter from Superintendent Hale of the Millbrook District explaining the circumstances of my departure. I left because my father was dying. I notified the school board in writing. The children were not left without instruction. The board arranged a replacement within the week. I can provide all of this in writing to anyone who wants to verify it." Silence. Then Margaret Tillis, still on her feet, said, "A letter from your own superintendent, who didn't press charges, doesn't clear a record. It just means someone chose to be lenient." "Press charges?" Adeline repeated. "For leaving a position to care for a dying parent. For abandonment of duty. I gave 3 weeks' notice. I left lesson plans for every subject. I helped identify a replacement candidate before I left." Adeline could hear her voice going flat and careful, which was what it did when she was working very hard to stay controlled. "My father died on the 8th of June. I kept the letter." "No one here is debating your father," Tillis said, smooth as river ice. "We're debating your judgment, your reliability, whether the children of this town should be placed in the care of a woman who, when circumstances became inconvenient, chose to walk away." "Circumstances became inconvenient," Adeline said softly. "He was dying." "So you say." The room felt different after that. Something had shifted. Not everyone was on Tillis's side. Adeline could see it in faces, a few people looking uncomfortable. One woman near the center aisle pressing her lips together as if she wanted to say something but hadn't decided to yet. But discomfort isn't the same as action, and the board members behind the table weren't looking at her. They were looking at their papers, or at their hands, or at Margaret Tillis. Harold Price shuffled some pages. "In light of the concerns raised," he started. "I'd like to present my documentation," Adeline said. "We'll receive it in writing," Price said. "Tonight's purpose is to discuss the appointment in light of new information." "What new information? She came here today and made accusations. Those aren't new information, they're opinions." "Miss Mercer." His voice was patient in a way that meant he'd already decided. "The board has a responsibility to the community. We need to take some time to review the situation before we can confirm the appointment." She felt it land, that phrase. Review the situation. She knew what it meant. She'd heard language like that before, in other places, said to other people. And she'd always understood it for what it was. A decision that had already been made, dressed up in procedural clothing so it felt fair. "How long?" she said. "We'll be in touch." "I traveled 400 miles for this position," she said. "I gave up my lease. I left behind—" She stopped herself. "How long?" "We'll be in touch," Price said again. She sat back down. She did not cry. She was 31 years old, and she had learned some years ago that crying in public in front of people who already doubted you only confirmed whatever they'd decided to believe. She sat down and she pressed her hands flat on her thighs again, and she breathed steadily while the chairman moved on to other business as if she were no longer in the room. Around her, people began to murmur to each other in low voices. She caught fragments. Millbrook. Heard the same thing, Tillis says. Wouldn't want her teaching my... She focused on the letter in her satchel, on her father's handwriting in the margin of the last letter he'd sent her, shaky by then, barely legible. You'll be fine, Addie. You always figure it out. She didn't feel like she was going to figure it out. When the meeting ended and the room began to empty, she stayed seated while the crowd moved past her, some of them studiously avoiding looking at her, some of them looking too much. She was trying to think. She had enough money for maybe 2 weeks at the hotel, if she was careful. She could go back to Dunmore, where she'd change trains and look for work, but she'd given up her previous contacts there. She could write to her cousin in the east, but that would take 2 weeks and the response would take another 2. She was 400 miles from anything she'd ever known, in a town that had just decided she wasn't trustworthy before she'd had a chance to teach a single lesson. She had thought, coming here, that she was beginning again. She hadn't counted on the beginning requiring this much. The hall was nearly empty when she finally stood, satchel over her shoulder, and made her way toward the door. The lamplighter outside was doing his rounds, the main street going amber in the early dusk, and the air had a snap to it that it hadn't had at noon. She stood on the step outside the meeting hall and didn't move. She became aware, gradually, that she wasn't alone. There was a man at the edge of the sidewalk, a few feet away, not looking at her but not quite moving either. He was perhaps 35, dark-haired, going gray at the temples, wearing a work shirt with the sleeves rolled up despite the evening chill. His hands were the kind of hands that told you his work before he said a word, scarred across the knuckles. The skin of his palms thickened, a faint burn mark on his right forearm that had healed white. A blacksmith, or something close to it. He hadn't been in the meeting. Or if he had, she hadn't noticed him. He glanced at her once, a brief look that took in the satchel and the trunk the hotel boy had brought down to the step, and then he looked back at the street. "You have a place to stay?" he asked. Not rudely, just directly, the way people ask things when they're not interested in pleasantries. "I have a hotel room," she said. He nodded. They stood there for a moment in what would have been an awkward silence if he'd seemed capable of being awkward. He looked like a man who was thinking something through. "My name's Gideon Ashcroft," he said finally. "I have a forge 2 blocks down. I also have 2 children who haven't had a teacher in 4 months, and before that had one who drank through half the school year." She looked at him. "I wasn't in the meeting," he said. "Heard about it from the livery man. Word travels faster than horses in this town." A pause. "Can you teach?" "Yes," she said. "Not can you teach in a building with a board behind you and a certificate on the wall? Can you actually teach?" It was such a direct question that she felt something loosen slightly in her chest, something she hadn't realized had been held tight since she walked into that hall. "Yes," she said again. He looked at her for a moment, really looked, the way some people do when they're deciding something. "I have a room above the forge," he said. "It's not much. Used to be storage. There's a window, a wood stove, a decent bed. My wife..." He stopped, started again. "It's been empty a year and a half. You'd have your own space, your own door. In exchange, I'd want you to teach my kids. 2 hours in the morning, whatever you think they need, and if you're willing, help them in the evenings with reading." He said it all the way a man presents terms for a business arrangement, plainly, without embellishment. "If the board comes around and gives you the school, that's fine. The offer doesn't change. But if they don't, you'd have a roof and work." She stared at him. "Why?" she said. "Because my son can't read his mother's name on her grave," he said, "and no one in this town has bothered to care about that." She didn't answer right away. She should have asked more questions, who the children were, how old, what he thought the trouble was with the boys reading, what he expected in terms of household arrangements, what the town would say about a woman living above a widower's shop. She knew what the town would say. She'd just spent an hour listening to what this town thought of women who made inconvenient choices. But she was tired. She was tired in a way that went deeper than the road, and the man in front of her had said the word teach, the way she felt it, not as a credential, but as an actual thing, a thing she did, something she was. "What's your son's name?" she asked. "Owen. He's 9. My daughter's Clara. She's 6. She adjusted the satchel on her shoulder. "I'll want to look at the room first," she said. "Fair enough," he said. He picked up her trunk before she could say anything about it and started walking. She followed him. The forge was a solid building, stone foundation, the kind built to last. Even at this hour, she could smell the residue of the day's work, coal smoke and hot metal and something cleaner underneath, the smell of finished iron. There was a wide double door in front, bolted now, and a narrower door to the side that led into a back workspace. He went around to a separate exterior staircase, wood, running up the side of the building. He carried her trunk up without apparent difficulty and unlocked a door at the top. It was indeed not much. A single room, maybe 12 feet by 10, with a slanted ceiling that followed the pitch of the roof, a bed against the far wall with a plain quilt on it, a small table and one chair. A wood stove that looked functional, a stack of split wood beside it. The window faced east and the last light was coming through it, making the room warmer in color than it probably was in the morning. It smelled of cedar and cold. It smelled like a room that had been empty and was waiting. He set her trunk against the wall near the door and stood there, taking up more space in the small room than he seemed to intend to. "There's a washroom inside the main house, around to the left of the kitchen," he said. "You'd have access to that. Meals. I cook or I try to. It's not—" He made a small gesture that she interpreted as an acknowledgement that the cooking was not his strength. "You're welcome to eat with us if you want. You're not obligated to." "The children?" she said. "Are they here now?" "Owen's probably in the workshop. Clara's asleep. She goes early." He paused. "Clara doesn't talk much. She used to. She's been quiet since her mother passed." Adeline thought of the boy first, because that was the detail she couldn't get past. Can't read his mother's name. "How long since your wife died?" she asked. 18 months. He said it the way you say a number you've said 100 times. Not numb exactly, but practiced. "Her name was Ruth." Adeline nodded. She looked at the room, the east-facing window, the clean quilt. "I'll take it," she said, "on a trial basis, 2 weeks. After that, we renegotiate if anything isn't working for either of us." He looked like he appreciated the directness of that. 2 weeks, he agreed. "I'll tell Owen in the morning." He moved toward the door and then stopped with his hand on the frame. "The town's going to talk," he said. "I know. Tillis in particular. I expect so." He seemed to want to say something more and decided not to. "The stove lights easily. There's matches on the mantel." He nodded once and went out, and she heard his boots on the stairs, steady and even, and then below her the distant sound of a latch and the house going quiet. She stood in the middle of the room with her satchel on her shoulder and her trunk against the wall and the last light failing in the east window. It was not what she'd planned. None of it. The meeting, the accusations, this bargain with a stranger in a town that had already decided who she was what she had planned. She set down the satchel. She started a fire in the stove. Outside, she could hear the town settling into evening, someone calling across the street, a dog, the creak of a wagon. Ordinary sounds of ordinary life going on without regard for her situation. She thought about her father, about the particular weight of the last months, how they'd contracted her world down to a single room, to medicines and meals and shallow breathing, to the daily discipline of presence when presence was all you had left to give. She had given everything she had to those months, and she didn't regret it. She would never regret it. But she had arrived here with the hope that giving that much had earned her something, some soft landing, some uncomplicated start. She wasn't going to get that. She sat on the edge of the bed and opened her satchel and took out the letter from Superintendent Hale. She'd read it so many times she nearly had it memorized. Circumstances beyond her control, professionalism beyond reproach, would recommend without reservation. She folded it carefully and put it back. Then she took out her teaching notebook, the small leather one where she kept notes on students. On the first blank page, she wrote 2 names, Owen Ashcroft 9. Reading difficulties. Mother, Ruth. Deceased 18 months. Clara Ashcroft, 6. Ceased speaking after mother's death. Listen carefully. She closed the notebook. Through the floor she heard, faint and small, the sound of a child's voice somewhere below. A question, she thought, though she couldn't make out the words. And then a man's voice answering, low and patient. She listened to that for a while. Then she pulled off her boots and lay down on the clean quilt with her coat over her and let herself be tired, just for tonight, before the work began. She was woken before dawn by the sound of the forge coming to life below her, the bellows, the particular ring of metal that she would come to know as the sound of Gideon starting his day. She lay still for a moment, orienting herself to the room, the slanted ceiling, the cold air against her face, the wood stove gone to embers in the night. She got up. She rebuilt the fire. She washed her face in the cold water from the pitcher on the table, braided her hair back, and put on her second dress, the one that wasn't travel-worn. She had come here to teach. Whatever else was happening, whatever the town thought of her, she had 2 students in a house below her, and that was something to work with. She was at the kitchen door by the time the sky was going gray, and she knocked. Gideon opened it. He was already marked with the morning's work, a smear of grease on his forearm, his hair uncombed, holding a coffee pot with the expression of a man who had already been awake for an hour and was operating on will rather than sleep. He looked at her for a beat, then stepped back from the door. "Coffee's on," he said. The kitchen was large and functional and not particularly clean. There was a long table in the center with mismatched chairs, and at one end of it, a boy of about 9 sat eating a biscuit and staring at her with an expression she recognized from years of first encounters. Wariness covered with curiosity, not sure yet which one to lead with. "Owen," Gideon said. The boy put down the biscuit. "This is Miss Mercer," Gideon said. "She's going to teach you." "We already have a school," Owen said. Not rudely, matter-of-factly, the way children state things they think adults have missed. "Miss Birch retired," Gideon said, "and before that she wasn't much use anyway." "She smelled bad," Owen said, even more matter-of-factly. Adeline sat down across from him without being invited, which was sometimes the better strategy. "What are you working on in school right now?" she asked. He looked at her warily. "Letters," he said. "Sums." "Which letters are giving you trouble?" He looked down at the table. "I can do letters?" he said. "I didn't say you couldn't," she said. "I asked which ones were giving you trouble." He was quiet. Then, "The ones that go the wrong way, B and D, I always mix them up." "Most people do for a while," she said. "There's a trick to them. I'll show you." She reached across the table and with her finger traced the letter B on the surface between them, then D. "See how B has his belly forward? He leads with his belly. D has her back to him. She's turning away." He stared at the table where her finger had moved. "Why's B a he and D a she?" he asked. "You can switch it if you want," she said. "The point is they're facing different directions. Once you remember that, belly forward," he said, and traced them himself. Once, twice. He sat back and seemed to be testing it in his head. "Okay," he said finally, with the particular grudging emphasis children use when something has worked despite their expectation that it wouldn't. Adeline heard a small sound behind her. She turned. Clara was standing in the kitchen doorway, still in her nightgown, her dark hair loose and tangled, holding a cloth rabbit against her chest. She was small for 6, fine-boned, with her father's dark eyes. She stood very still, watching Adeline with the pure and unsettling attention that some young children have, the kind that makes you feel you're being read. Adeline turned back to Owen. She didn't make a fuss. She didn't reach toward Clara or speak loudly or do any of the things adults tended to do when trying too hard with a quiet child. "After breakfast," she said to Owen, "show me what you've been working from. Spelling lists, sums pages, whatever your teacher left you. We'll see where we are." "It's in the workshop," Owen said. "After breakfast," she said again. She heard the soft pat of small feet behind her, and then Clara was at the bench beside Owen. And when Adeline glanced over, she saw that Clara was watching her still, but close now, curious, the rabbit in her lap. Gideon set a cup of coffee near Adeline's elbow without comment and went back to the stove. Through the back window, the sky was going from gray to pale gold. This was the first morning. There would be difficult ones ahead, Adeline knew. Mornings when the children didn't want to work, mornings when the board made its position clear in some new way, mornings when the town's opinion felt like weather, something you had to move through to get anywhere. But this was the first morning, and Owen had said okay, and Clara had come to sit at the table. Adeline drank her coffee. She thought it was a beginning. The first week passed the way first weeks usually do. Not smoothly, not disastrously, but in that grinding middle territory where nothing is yet established and everything has to be figured out from scratch each morning. Adeline had taught long enough to know that the first few days with any student were less about teaching and more about listening. You had to find the shape of what they already knew before you could figure out where the gaps were, and the gaps were never exactly where people expected them to be. Owen, for instance, was further along in arithmetic than anyone had given him credit for. He could do sums in his head faster than she could write them on the slate, and he had a practical grasp of measurement, how many board feet in a plank, how many pounds in a hundredweight, that told her he'd been learning at his father's side whether he knew it or not. But his reading was genuinely difficult, not from lack of intelligence, but from something in the way certain letters arranged themselves on the page that his mind resisted. She had seen it before. She knew what to do about it. It just took time and repetition and patience, none of which had apparently been offered him before. Clara was a different problem entirely. She would sit at the table every morning with her cloth rabbit and her careful attention, and she would do everything Adeline asked, trace letters, count objects, sort things by color or size, but she did it all without making a sound. She didn't refuse to speak. She didn't flinch away or seem distressed. She simply didn't use words, the way some people don't use a door that's been difficult for a long time and have found other ways around. Adeline did not push her. She had learned early in her teaching years that pushing a silent child usually produced more silence. Instead, she narrated things, said aloud what she was doing, asked questions she didn't expect answered, occasionally directed a remark at the cloth rabbit in a tone that made Owen snort and Clara almost smile. Almost. On the fourth day, Gideon came in from the forge at noon to find Adeline sitting on the floor of the workshop. She had moved the lessons there when the kitchen got too cold, the forge's residual heat making it the warmest room in the building, with both children cross-legged across from her, and she was reading to them from a book about a boy who traveled by river raft across unknown territories. She read with voices for each character, which was something her own teacher had done when she was small, and which she had always felt was the difference between a story being told and a story being given. Owen was leaning forward with his elbows on his knees. Claire had the rabbit pressed against her mouth, which Adeline had come to understand was what she did when she was deeply interested in something. Gideon stood in the doorway for a moment without announcing himself. Adeline saw him in her peripheral vision, but didn't stop reading. He went back out without saying anything. Later, when the children had gone to do their evening chores and Adeline was at the kitchen table reorganizing Owen's arithmetic pages into some kind of logical sequence, Gideon came in and poured himself coffee and stood at the counter in that way he had of occupying space without taking up too much of it. "He's behind in reading," Adeline said, not looking up from the pages. "But he's ahead in practical mathematics. He's been taught by watching you work. You probably don't realize how much he's absorbed." Gideon was quiet for a moment. "He never said anything to me about the reading." "He's embarrassed," she said. "Boys that age usually are. It helps that his sister can't tell anyone." It came out more blunt than she intended, and she glanced up to see how he took it. He looked at his coffee cup with an expression she couldn't read. "Clara used to talk," he said. "Before. She talked constantly. Ruth used to say she came out of the womb with opinions." Something moved in his face that he controlled before it could go anywhere. "She stopped the day after the funeral. Just stopped. Hasn't said a word in 18 months. Has she seen a doctor?" "2 of them. First one said she'd come back to it on her own. Second one said to be patient." He paused. "I've been patient." "I know," Adeline said. She put down the pages. "She communicates. There's nothing absent about her. She's very present, she just isn't using language right now. Something got associated for her, I think. Talking and loss, they got tangled up somehow. She turned her coffee cup in her hands, thinking, I'm not a doctor, but I've had one student in all my years who did something like this. She was 7. What helped her was when the talking didn't feel expected, when it could just happen or not happen, and either way was fine. Gideon leaned back against the counter. He was watching her the way he sometimes did, steadily, not intrusively, but like a man who was paying close attention and filing things away. What eventually made her talk, he asked. She was trying to warn another child away from a beehive, and there wasn't time to find any other way, Adeline said. She yelled, stop, and then she started crying because she hadn't meant to. And we all pretended, very convincingly, that nothing unusual had happened. She paused. It took another 2 months after that before she was back to normal. But that was the first word. Gideon nodded slowly. Neither of them said anything for a moment. The board sent a letter, he said. She looked up. He went to the shelf by the back door and handed her an envelope. It had already been opened. He'd clearly not intended to hide that. He handed it over with the flap up. She took out the single page. Dear Miss Mercer, the Board of Education of Red Hollow wishes to inform you that your appointment is currently under review pending additional documentation. You are requested to submit the following: original teaching certificate, letters of reference from no fewer than 2 previous positions, and a written account of the circumstances of your departure from the Millbrook District. Until the board has reviewed these materials, your position cannot be confirmed. We appreciate your patience. Harold Price, Chairman. She read it twice. Then she folded it and put it back in the envelope and set it on the table. Additional documentation, she said. They're stalling, Gideon said. I know what they're doing. She put her hand flat on the envelope, then removed it. I have everything they've asked for. I can have it to Price by tomorrow morning. She paused. The question is whether they'll actually read it. Tillis is on the board unofficially, he said. She's not a member, but Price's wife is her cousin, and 2 of the other members have children in the primary school. She doesn't need a vote. Adeline absorbed this. You know this town well. Lived here 12 years, he said. Watched it work. He took a drink of his coffee. I should tell you. A man came to the forge today. Merchant. Owns the dry goods store on the north end. His name is Caldwell. What did he want? Said he'd heard you were looking for a permanent position. Said he has a cousin in a town called Ferris Point, about 30 miles east. Apparently they need a teacher there and the pay is better. He said this without any particular inflection. He said he'd write the introduction himself if you were interested. She looked at him. Why would he do that? Because Caldwell's wife is Tillis's closest friend, he said, and Ferris Point is 30 miles away. The silence in the kitchen had a particular texture to it. So it's a removal offer, Adeline said. Dressed as a favor, Gideon said. She stood up and gathered Owen's arithmetic papers into a neat stack. She felt something in her chest that was partly anger and partly something colder and more durable. The thing that had gotten her through 6 months of her father's dying and everything that came after, the part of her that simply refused, in quiet and without ceremony, to be moved. Tell Mr. Caldwell thank you, she said. I'm not looking for a position. I have one. Gideon said nothing. But she thought, briefly, that something shifted in his expression, something small and not quite a smile. She took the board's letter to her room and spent the evening composing her response. She was methodical about it, the way she was methodical about everything when she was upset. More careful, not less. She wrote a covering letter to Price that was entirely professional and gave him nothing to use against her, assembled her original certificate, the letter from Superintendent Hale, the reference from her first position in Castleton, and a signed statement from the Millbrook School Board member who had actually handled her resignation. She had kept every piece of paper. She had learned, early, that paper was the only thing that held against reputation. She delivered the packet to Price's office before 8 in the morning and was back at the forge for Owen's lesson by past. What she didn't account for was what Tillis would do with the time the board spent reviewing it. It started with the women at the well. Red Hollow had a public pump at the corner of Main and 2nd, and on weekday mornings it drew a particular crowd. The women who kept house or kept their husbands' books or kept themselves busy with the machinery of town social life. Adeline passed it on her way back from Price's office and heard her name before she was close enough for anyone to pretend they hadn't been talking about her. She kept walking. She didn't look. But by midweek, she was feeling the shape of it everywhere. The hotel clerk, who had been cautiously friendly in those first days, became careful. The woman at the dry goods store counted her change twice and didn't make eye contact. Two boys on the main street said something to each other behind her back, and when she turned around, they were already looking elsewhere. And the worst of it, on Thursday afternoon, a woman named Patton, whose daughter was one of the upper grade students at the schoolhouse, 8 years old, smart as anything, the kind of child who collected words like other children collected stones, came to the forge looking for Gideon. Adeline was alone in the workshop with Owen and Clara when Mrs. Patton knocked at the open door. She was a thin woman, younger than Adeline expected, with a distracted quality about her, like someone always half listening for a sound in another room. "I was looking for Mr. Ashcroft," she said, looking past Adeline into the workshop. "He's at the livery doing a fitting," Adeline said. "He'll be back by 4. Mrs. Patton looked at Owen, then at Clara, then at Adeline with an expression that had something apologetic in it but was harder around the edges than apology. "I wanted to ask him," she said, "about the arrangement here, whether he'd considered how it might look. To the children." She paused. "My daughter Nora asks about, she's heard things, about who's living here, and I want to understand." "What has your daughter heard?" Adeline asked. Mrs. Patton pressed her lips together. "That a woman is living above a widower's shop, without a formal arrangement." "I teach his children," Adeline said. "I rent a room. The terms are practical and clearly understood by everyone involved." "I'm sure they are," Mrs. Patton said, in a tone that communicated the opposite. "But people talk, and children hear what people say. And Nora asked me if it was true that the woman staying here was the one who abandoned her students and is now—" She stopped. Tried again. "I don't want to believe everything I hear, but I also have to think about my daughter's—" "Your daughter's what?" Adeline said, carefully. "Her education," Mrs. Patton said. "Her surroundings. The example she's—" "I have never," Adeline said, each word placed deliberately, "abandoned a student. I left a position to care for my dying father with 3 weeks' notice, a replacement arranged, and lesson plans prepared for every subject. Every piece of documentation that proves this has been submitted to the school board." She paused. "And your daughter has never been in my care. She's in the schoolhouse with the instructor who is actually employed there." Mrs. Patton had gone slightly pink. "I just wanted to—" "I understand," Adeline said. "You're repeating what you heard. I'm telling you what is true. What you do with the difference is your own decision." The silence between them lasted about 4 seconds. Then Mrs. Patton nodded, once stiffly, and left. Owen, who had been sitting very still with a chalk slate in his lap since Mrs. Patton appeared, said, without looking up from the slate, "She's Nora Patton's mom. Nora tells everyone everything." "I noticed," Adeline said. "Mrs. Tillis talks to her at the well on Tuesdays," he said, still not looking up. Then, "I heard you tell her the truth." "That's what you do when someone repeats something false," Adeline said. "You say what's true. Then you keep working." She sat back down across from him and pushed the open book toward him. "Where were we?" she said. He found the line without being told and put his finger under the first word. That night, Adeline sat at the small table in her room above the forge and opened the account book she'd found on Gideon's kitchen shelf a few days earlier. Not snooping, she'd been looking for a piece of paper to write on and pulled down the wrong thing. But what she'd seen in the few seconds before she realized what it was had stayed with her. The columns were months behind. Receivables he hadn't collected, expenses entered twice in different places, a credit from the mill that hadn't been recorded against the debt it was meant to offset. She had asked him about it briefly the next morning. He'd looked at the floor and said, "Ruth did the books. I haven't figured out how to—" He stopped. "I keep up with the work, the numbers in my head, but the paper side, I can do it," she said. "If you want, in the evenings." He looked at her with an expression she still hadn't quite categorized. Not suspicion and not gratitude, something between them, a kind of careful attention. "You don't have to," he said. "I know," she said. "Do you want me to?" A pause. "Yes." So she'd taken the book. She'd been working through it for 3 evenings now, an hour or two at a time when the children were in bed and the forge was quiet below her. It was actually not as bad as it first looked. The records were all there, just scattered, entered by a man doing it by feel rather than method. She had found a system for them and was slowly making the columns say what they actually meant. It was, she realized on the 4th evening, the most settled she had felt since arriving in Red Hollow. Not happy, exactly. Not comfortable, but purposeful. She had things to do, and she knew how to do them, and there were 2 children downstairs who were showing incremental, stubborn, real signs of progress, and an account book that was going to make sense before she was finished with it. On Friday of the 2nd week, something happened that she hadn't anticipated. She was at the pump. She had made herself stop avoiding it after the 2nd day because avoiding it only gave it more power, filling the household's water pail, when a woman she hadn't seen before appeared beside her and took hold of the pump handle to help. The woman was perhaps 60, stout, with a face that had spent a great deal of time outdoors and had opinions about it. "I'm Vera Holst," the woman said. "I live on the Ridge Road. I've been away visiting my sister for 2 weeks, or I'd have introduced myself sooner." She worked the pump with the ease of someone who had done it 10,000 times. "I heard about the meeting." "Most people have," Adeline said. "I also heard you moved into Ashcroft's place and started teaching those 2 kids." She studied Adeline without much pretense of not doing so. "Owen get any better?" "Yes," Adeline said. "Clara say anything yet?" "No." Vera nodded. "Ruth was my friend," she said. "Best friend I had in this valley. I've been keeping an eye on those children since she died, but I'm not—" She made a gesture. "I'm not able to do what you can do. I can feed them and check in on Gideon and make sure nobody's gone sick, but I can't—" She paused. Owen couldn't read his own name last spring. Not all of it. "He's improving," Adeline said. "That's what I'm saying." Vera handed her back the pail. "Tillis ran off the last 2 teachers they had here before you. One was drinking, fair enough. The other one she just didn't like. Woman had her way of running things, and if you weren't part of that way, she found a use for you elsewhere." She looked at Adeline steadily. "You planning to stay?" Adeline thought about the question seriously. "I didn't come 400 miles to leave in a month," she said. Vera seemed satisfied with that. She picked up her own pail. "My grandson's 11, she said. "He's been in Tillis's primary school for 2 years, and he still can't do long division." She paused. "I might send him to you, if that's not too much trouble." "Send him Monday," Adeline said. Vera nodded and walked away with her pail and the particular unhurried certainty of someone who had decided something. Adeline watched her go and felt, for the first time since arriving in Red Hollow, that she might not be entirely alone in this. The weekend brought a development she hadn't expected from that direction. Saturday afternoon, Owen was in the workshop helping his father, assisting, really, mostly handing things and occasionally asking questions that showed he'd been paying attention to more than Adeline's lessons, when Gideon sent him to fetch a tool from the storage area, and he came back instead with a question. "There's a box up there," Owen said, "with Mom's name on it." Gideon went very still. "It's her handwriting box," Owen said, "the one with her letters in it." Adeline was at the kitchen doorway. She hadn't meant to be in this moment. She'd been bringing out the afternoon coffee and stopped when she heard Owen's voice. "I know which box it is," Gideon said quietly. "I want to read her letters," Owen said. "The ones to you." A silence. The kind that has weight. "Those are private," Gideon said. "I know," Owen said. He looked at his father. "But I can almost read. Miss Mercer says she says in another month I could read most things. I want to be able to read her handwriting." He swallowed. "Before I forget what it looks like." Adeline put down the coffee and went back into the kitchen. She stood with her hands on the table and listened to the silence from the workshop. Then she heard Gideon's voice, low and unsteady at the edges. "Okay, we'll find some of her easier letters, the short ones, and you'll read them with Miss Mercer, not alone." "Okay," Owen said, and then, after a pause, "Thanks, Dad." She heard Gideon's boots on the floor as he moved away, the quick, deliberate movement of a man putting distance between himself and a feeling before it could catch him. She was back at the stove, stirring something that didn't need stirring, when he came into the kitchen. He stood at the counter. She didn't look at him directly. "You don't have to help with that," he said. "I know," she said. "It's more than what we agreed to. Most useful things are." He poured himself coffee. She heard him take a drink, set down the cup. "He's different than he was," Gideon said. 6 weeks ago, he wouldn't open a book. "He was never afraid of books," she said. "He was afraid of failing at them. There's a difference." She finally looked at him. "He's not failing." Gideon looked at her with that expression again, the one she still hadn't managed to fully categorize. It had something in it she was beginning to recognize, though. Something careful and not given easily. A particular quality of attention that meant more than looking. "Caldwell came back," he said. She set down the spoon. "He came to the forge directly this time," Gideon said. "Said the offer's still open. Ferris Point, 30 miles east. Said he'd write the introduction today if you gave the word." He paused. "He also said—" He stopped. Started again. "He said the town council is considering a formal request that the school board decline your documentation on grounds of incomplete references. That if you go now, voluntarily, there won't be anything formally on your record." She turned that over. "Voluntarily," she said. He used that word. "If I go voluntarily," she said, "there's nothing on my record. If I stay and they decline my documentation, there's a formal board rejection attached to my name." She said it flat, like reading from a ledger. "That's not a favor. That's a threat delivered through a polite intermediary." "Yes," Gideon said. She picked up the spoon again. Put it down again. "And you?" she said. "What do you think?" He was quiet for long enough that she looked at him. "I think," he said slowly, "that if you go, Owen goes back to where he was 3 months ago by spring. And Clara," he stopped. "I think if you go, this house goes back to being the way it was before you came into it. Which is to say," he seemed to be choosing words with more care than he usually bothered with. "Functional, but not what it should be." She didn't say anything. "I'm not trying to pressure you," he said. "I mean it when I say you should decide based on what's right for you. Not because I need—" "Gideon," she said. He stopped. "I already decided," she said. "I told Caldwell no. Whatever he comes back with, the answer is no." He looked at her. "I came 400 miles, she said. "I didn't come here to be moved along by someone's cousin." He picked up his coffee. She saw his jaw shift, the movement of a man's face when something releases that had been held. The following Monday, as promised, Vera Holst's grandson Martin appeared at the forge door with his cap in his hands and the wary expression of a child being sent somewhere against his will. He was big for 11, broad-shouldered, with Vera's outdoor complexion and none of her certainty. "Gran says I'm to do sums," he said. "You are," Adeline said. "Come in." Owen looked at Martin with the calibrating expression of a child assessing a potential rival and deciding, provisionally, that he was acceptable. Clara looked at Martin. Martin looked at Clara. Clara held up the cloth rabbit, briefly, then put it back in her lap. Martin sat down without being told. That was Monday. By Wednesday, the thing Adeline had half suspected began to happen. Martin's mother mentioned to a neighbor that her son was finally learning long division. The neighbor's daughter was behind in spelling. By Thursday afternoon, she had 4 students in the workshop: Owen, Clara, Martin, and a girl of 10 named Bess, whose mother had dropped her off with a look on her face that mixed defiance with hope in about equal measure. Adeline said nothing about what this meant. She just made room at the table. She thought about the schoolhouse at the end of the street, with its bell above the door that wasn't ringing for her. She thought about Price's letter and Caldwell's visits, and the women at the pump on Tuesday mornings. She thought about Owen, the evening before, slowly sounding out a sentence from one of his mother's shorter letters, his finger moving carefully under each word, his face concentrated in a way that was almost painful to watch, and the moment, sudden and quiet, when he looked up and said, "She says she hopes I like the taste of honey, because she's keeping bees in the spring." He'd looked at the paper again, then at his hands, She was going to keep bees, he said. I know, Adeline said. She didn't get to. No, Adeline said. She didn't. He folded the letter carefully and set it on the table between them and sat with it for a while, not crying, just sitting with the fact of it the way people have to sometimes. Adeline sat with him. She didn't try to make it better, or move past it, or redirect. She just let it be what it was. After a while, he picked up his reader and found his page. Okay, he said. The forge kept its heat below her room. Winter was working its way deeper into the valley now, mornings hard with frost, the hills to the north going white. But the room above the forge was warm, and the kitchen was warm, and 4 children sat around the workshop table every morning, now making the slow, irregular, irreversible kind of progress that looked like nothing from the outside and felt like everything from within. The board had not responded to her documentation. She had not heard from Price. Caldwell had not come back a third time. She did not know what was coming, but she knew what she was doing, and she knew why she was doing it, and for now that was enough to keep working. By the 3rd week of November, there were 7 children in Gideon's workshop every morning, and the workshop had ceased to look like a workshop at all. Adeline had moved the smaller tools to the back wall and covered the workbench with a piece of sailcloth she'd found folded in the storage area. She'd dragged in 2 extra chairs from the kitchen and found a short plank that, balanced across 2 sawhorses, made a reasonable second table. The forge itself she'd asked Gideon to keep banked low during lesson hours, which he did without complaint, coming in earlier to get his heavy work done before 8 and saving the afternoon for jobs that didn't require full heat. It was not a schoolhouse. The floor was stone and cold unless you sat close to the forge. The light came from 2 windows that faced north and 1 oil lamp that Adeline kept on the main table. The children had to share slates and sometimes argued about it. Martin, the oldest, had a habit of tapping his chalk when he was thinking, which drove Bess to distraction, and Owen had recently discovered that if he leaned back in his chair at exactly the right angle, he could make it rock without falling, which he did constantly until Adeline looked at him, at which point he stopped until she looked away. It was imperfect in a dozen ways. It was also the most alive Adeline had felt in a classroom in years. The children had stopped treating the space as temporary. They'd started having preferences. Bess liked to sit with her back to the forge wall where the warmth was steadiest. Martin always took the end of the plank closest to the window. Owen and Clara sat together as they always had. A girl named Judith had joined them the previous week, 9 years old, brought by her father who worked the mill, and said almost nothing except that his daughter was sharp and wasn't being challenged where she was. He wasn't wrong. Judith had worked through everything Adeline gave her in half the time expected, and now Adeline was reaching back into her own memory for things she'd learned as a student herself, material that had seemed excessive for this age, but clearly wasn't, not for this child. There was a rhythm to the mornings. Adeline had given up pretending this was going to be brief, but the town wasn't pretending alongside her. The first real shot came on a Thursday, 11 days before the school board's scheduled December meeting. Adeline was at the pump. She went early now, before the Tuesday crowd, having adjusted her schedule to avoid the specific gauntlet of women who gathered there, when she heard boots on the planked walk behind her and turned to find Harold Price. He was wearing his good coat despite the cold, which told her this wasn't accidental. Men like Price didn't put on their good coat to go to the pump unless they were making a point about their own authority. "Miss Mercer," he said, I'm glad I caught you." "Mr. Price," she said. He clasped his hands behind his back and looked at the pump rather than at her, in the manner of someone who has prepared what he's going to say and doesn't want to be thrown off it. "The board has reviewed your documentation," he said. She waited. "The certificate is in order. The letter from Superintendent Hale is acceptable." A pause. "There is, however, a concern about your current living situation and the manner in which you've been operating a teaching arrangement without board sanction." "I'm teaching privately," she said, "in a private residence. The board has no jurisdiction over private instruction. The board has concerns about the impression this creates. A woman living with—" "I rent a room," she said, "above a smithy. I teach the children of the man who owns that smithy. This is a private arrangement." "Mrs. Tillis has—" "Mrs. Tillis," Adeline said carefully, does not sit on this board. Price's mouth pressed together. He was not a bad man, she thought. Not exactly. He was a careful man, and he had placed his careful nature in service of the wrong person, which amounted to much the same result. The December meeting, he said, will take up the question of your appointment formally. I want to advise you, in good faith, that the atmosphere is not, that you may want to consider your options. My option, she said, is to appear at that meeting with my documentation and make my case. Other arrangements might be more, Mr. Price. She picked up her pail. I've done nothing wrong. I've submitted everything requested. If the board wants to discuss my fitness to teach, I'll be there to discuss it. She looked at him squarely. I'd suggest the board be prepared to discuss theirs. She walked away. Her heart was going too fast, but her step was even, and that was the part that mattered. She told Gideon that evening, not the whole exchange, but the essential facts. The December meeting, the board's hesitation, the clear direction things were moving. He listened without interrupting, leaning against the kitchen counter with his arms crossed and his eyes on the floor. How much time? He said. 3 weeks to the meeting. If they decline my appointment formally, I'd have grounds to appeal, but that takes months, and I'd need somewhere to be while I did it. You're already somewhere, he said. She looked at him. I mean, you don't have to leave, he said. Whatever the board decides, the arrangement here doesn't depend on them. It does in one way, she said. If they formally reject me, it goes on record. Every school board in the state can see it. It would follow me. He was quiet. He turned his coffee cup on the counter. Then we make sure they don't get to formally reject you, he said. She wasn't sure what he meant by that. She thought he might not be sure either, entirely. But there was a firmness in how he said it that she recognized, the tone of a man who had decided something and was only now catching up to his own decision. The next morning brought another child, then 2 more the following Monday. By the first week of December, Adeline had 11 students in the workshop, ranging from Clara's 6 to Judith's 9 to Martin's 11. The plank table had been extended with a second plank. Gideon had, without mentioning it, built a narrow shelf along the south wall and put up 3 hooks where the children could hang their coats. She noticed the hooks on a Tuesday morning when she came down to start the stove. She ran her finger along the shelf, new wood, just sanded, the smell of it still fresh. He'd done it at night, after the children were in bed. She didn't say anything to him about it, but she thought about it. The thing about Gideon was that he didn't perform consideration. He didn't announce what he was doing or frame it as generosity or wait to be thanked. He simply noticed what was needed and addressed it quietly, and went back to his work. The hooks for coats. The way he always banked the forge before 8 without her having to ask after the first time. The evening she came down for water and found the account books already on the kitchen table, open to the page she'd been working on, a candle lit beside them. She had thanked him for that one. He'd said, "You were going to come down for them anyway." She had looked at him and thought that he was in fact a strange man, not difficult, not remote, but self-contained in a way that made small things visible. He didn't make speeches. He just kept doing the small things, and eventually you realized that all those small things added up to something with weight. She was aware she should be more careful about this realization. She was not entirely managing to be. The conflict that had been building at the edges of the town's attention came into the open on a Saturday in early December, 1 week before the board meeting at the feed store. Adeline had gone for oats. She'd taken over the household shopping in the second week without ceremony, because she was going anyway, and because Gideon's method of shopping involved buying only exactly what was needed and then running out of things. And she was at the counter when she heard Margaret Tillis's voice from the dry goods section 2 aisles over. She hadn't seen Tillis up close since the night of the meeting. She'd felt her presence in town the way you feel weather, in the way rooms shifted, in the particular tone of certain women's voices when Adeline was nearby. But they hadn't occupied the same space. They did now. Tillis came around the end of the aisle and stopped when she saw Adeline. She had a woman with her, younger, softer, whom Adeline recognized as Price's wife. "Miss Mercer," Tillis said. She said it the way some people say interesting. "Mrs. Tillis?" Adeline said. Price's wife looked between them and took a small step to the side, the instinctive movement of someone who expects 2 things to collide. I heard you had quite a gathering at the smithy this week, Tillis said. I'm teaching, Adeline said. Several families have found it useful. 11 children, Tillis said. By my count. I haven't counted lately. I have, Tillis said. 7 of them were enrolled in the schoolhouse. 3 of them are now absent from classes they should be attending. She paused. You're not a licensed operator of a school. You don't have board approval. What you're doing is irregular. Private tutoring, Adeline said, requires no board approval. 11 students, Tillis said, is not tutoring. It's a school. Running a school without a charter is against county regulations. Adeline looked at her. She felt the charge of it, the precision of the attack, the way it had been prepared, the specific language chosen. Against county regulations. Not a personal accusation. A procedural one. Harder to argue against in public without looking like she was arguing against order itself. I'll look into the regulations, Adeline said. You should, Tillis said, before the board meeting. She moved past Adeline to the counter without hurrying, the movement of someone who feels they have just accomplished what they came to accomplish. Price's wife followed, not looking at Adeline. The clerk, a teenage boy who had been very busy rearranging a display of tin goods behind the counter, did not look up until they were gone. Adeline paid for her oats and walked back to the forge in the cold, and went directly up to her room and sat on the edge of her bed and thought. County regulations. She didn't know the county regulations on private instruction. She should have. She'd been a teacher long enough to know you check these things. But she'd been focused on the board and the documentation and the daily work of 11 children, and she'd missed it. She spent the afternoon with the county ordinance pamphlet she found at the land office, reading it twice. When she came down for dinner, she knew what she needed to know, and she also knew it wasn't quite as bad as Tillis had implied, but it wasn't entirely fine either. A private instructor teaching more than 8 students regularly could be considered an unlicensed school. She had 11. She told Gideon after the children were in bed. He sat with it for a moment. 8, he said. If I had 8 or fewer, there's no grounds for a complaint. You have 11. Yes. He was quiet. She watched him working through it. If you turn away 3 children, he said slowly, Tillis has made you smaller. She's gotten you to limit yourself with your own hand. He paused. And the 3 you turn away go back to what? Sitting in her school, not learning what they should be learning? Yes, Adeline said. That's not a solution, he said. No, she said. It's not. She turned the pamphlet over. The other path is to apply for a formal charter, which requires board approval, which takes us back to December. He looked at her steadily. What does a charter require? A permanent location, a registered instructor, evidence of curriculum. She paused. And board approval of the instructor, which is what they're deciding in a week. Yes. He stood up abruptly and went to the window and stood with his back to her, looking out at the dark yard. She waited. I'm going to that meeting, he said. Gideon, I went to that first meeting and I should have said something. He turned around. I didn't because I don't know what I thought, that it would sort itself out, that Price would read the documentation and do the right thing. His expression had something frustrated in it, directed inward rather than at her. I've been watching this town treat you like something it's trying to get rid of for 2 months, and I've been quiet about it because that's what I do. I stay quiet and I work, and I let people do what they're going to do. He stopped. But those are my children in that workshop, and what's happening to them? What's happened to Owen since you've been here? Nobody gets to just... He stopped again. He was not a man who made long speeches, and he was running up against the limits of that. You don't have to defend me, she said. That's not what I'm doing, he said. It's not about defending you. You can defend yourself. He looked at her directly. I'm going because I have something to say, something that's true, and that no one in that room has thought to ask about. He paused. Whether they listen to it is their business, but I'm saying it. She wanted to ask him what it was, what the thing was he had to say, but she had a feeling that if she asked him, he would show her rather than tell her, the way he did most things. The week before the meeting was the hardest. Tillis filed a formal complaint with the county, which arrived at the forge in the form of a letter from the county registrar giving Adeline 30 days to reduce her student count or apply for a charter. The timing was deliberate. Just before the board meeting, just enough pressure to make her feel she was approaching from weakness rather than standing. 3 of the 11 parents came to her separately to ask what was happening. She told them the truth. There was a procedural question about the size of the class. It was being addressed. She did not expect it to interrupt lessons. 2 of them nodded and left. The third, Bess's mother, a woman named Harriet Frome, who had 3 children and very little patience, said flatly, "Tillis can file whatever she likes. Bess stays." Adeline found she needed that more than she expected to. On the Tuesday before the meeting, something shifted with Clara. It happened during the afternoon reading hour, which Adeline had begun keeping separately from the morning lessons. The younger 3 children, Clara, Bess, and a quiet boy named Sam, who had just turned 7, sitting together with Adeline while she read aloud, and they tracked the words in their own copies of the same passage, a technique for connecting sound to text that she'd developed over years of trial and modification. She was reading from the River Raft book. They were most of the way through it now, and the children knew the characters well enough to have opinions about them, which was always the sign that a book had worked. And she came to a passage where the boy in the story loses something he thought he'd kept safe, a letter from his father, dropped in the current and gone. She read it through. She always read a passage once without stopping, then went back to discuss. She looked up, and Clara was crying. Not dramatically, just the slow, quiet tears of a child who has been hit somewhere real, her chin pressed down against the rabbit, her shoulders slightly forward. Bess noticed and went still. Sam looked at Clara, then at Adeline, uncertain what the protocol was. Adeline set down the book. "It's a sad part," she said simply. Clara nodded. Once, the rabbit pressed against her face. "The letter is gone," Adeline said, "and that's real. That's a real kind of loss. When something that belonged to someone you love can't be kept safe." Clara was still crying, quietly, steadily. Adeline waited, and then, small, half-smothered against the rabbit, so that for a moment Adeline wasn't sure she'd heard it, Clara said, "Like Mama's bee letters." The workshop went absolutely still. Even the fire seemed to hold. Adeline kept her face and her voice exactly level. "Yes," she said, "like your Mama's letters about the bees. Owen showed me one." Clara looked at Adeline over the top of the rabbit. Her eyes were wet and very dark and very clear. "He read it," Clara said. Her voice was rough with disuse, the texture of something long unplayed. "Owen read her letters." "Yes," Adeline said. "He worked very hard. He can read them now." Clara held the rabbit tighter. She was looking at Adeline with something that was partly relief and partly something more like wonder, as if she had discovered that the world was still containing things she hadn't expected. "I want to read them too," Clara said. "I know," Adeline said. "We'll work on it. You're going to be able to." Sam, beside Clara, had been watching all of this with the grave attention of a 7-year-old witnessing something he recognizes as important without being able to name why. Then he turned back to his reading copy and found his place and put his finger carefully under the next word, returning to the work in the instinctive way of children who understand that the lesson is still the lesson. Adeline sat with the sound of Clara's voice for a moment before she followed his lead. She went up to her room that evening and sat at the table and didn't open the account book. She sat with her hands flat on the table and thought about what 2 months of patience looked like when it actually arrived. She thought, Owen read his mother's name on the page. Clara said her first words. She thought, Tillis is filing county complaints, and Price is stalling, and Caldwell is delivering threats. And none of them have a single thing to do with what is actually happening in that workshop. She thought about the December meeting, 1 week away, and what was coming. She was not under any illusion that Gideon's presence there would change the board's math. Tillis had Price's vote and 2 others, and a man showing up to speak for a woman he'd taken into his household was as likely to confirm suspicion as dissolve it. But she also thought about what he'd said. I have something to say, something that's true. She didn't know exactly what he meant to do, But she thought about the way he'd looked when he said it, not angry, not performing conviction, just settled into something, the way metal settles when it's cooled into its final shape. She fell asleep before she meant to and woke at 2 in the morning with the stove gone cold and her neck stiff from sleeping at the table. She rebuilt the fire, went to bed properly, and lay awake watching the frost patterns on the window until the forge started up below her and the smell of coal smoke came through the floor and she knew the morning had started without her. She got up. The children arrived in ones and twos between 8 and 8:30, the older ones coming alone, the younger ones dropped by parents who now knocked on the workshop door the way you knock on a door you have a right to knock on. Martin came in shaking snow from his hat. Bess came with 2 extra biscuits wrapped in cloth because her mother had made too many. Owen was already there. He was always already there, sitting with his reading copy open at the table before anyone else arrived. Clara came in last, held the door for Sam behind her, and sat down in her usual place. Adeline was at the slate board. Gideon had hung a proper slate board on the east wall 2 weeks ago, again without announcing it, writing out the morning's arithmetic problems. She heard Clara's chair scrape back on the stone floor. Then, "Miss Mercer." Adeline turned. Clara had her hand up. An actual hand up, the way Adeline had taught them to signal a question in the first week. Not because she was strict about it, but because it stopped 3 children from asking things simultaneously, which otherwise happened constantly. Adeline almost smiled. She kept her voice level. "Yes, Clara." "I forgot my slate at the house," Clara said. Her voice was still a little rough, still feeling its way back into use, but it was steady. "Can I share with Owen?" "You may," Adeline said. "And yes, you can." Owen looked at his sister. Clara sat back down and pulled his slate between them without ceremony. Owen looked back at his book with the careful expression of a 9-year-old boy who has understood that what just happened was significant and has decided that the most respectful thing he can do is treat it as normal. Martin, across the table, was looking at his arithmetic problems with slightly more attention than they required. Bess was eating her second biscuit. Sam had arrived and was unwinding his scarf with the focused determination of a child working against a difficult knot. Adeline turned back to the slate board. The December meeting was 6 days away. She would present her documentation, make her case, and stand in that room and say what was true as many times as it needed to be said. Whatever happened after that was the board's decision to make, and the town's conscience to answer for. She wrote the first arithmetic problem on the board. Behind her, the workshop filled up with the sounds of children arriving at work, chalk on slate, the scrape of chairs, 2 voices debating something quietly, the particular quality of attention that settles into a room when people are about to begin. Gideon came through from the forge at 8:30, as he sometimes did for the coffee she put on at the start of the morning. He stopped in the doorway of the workshop and looked at the room. Clara looked up from the slate she was sharing with Owen. "Morning, Papa," she said. She said it the way children say ordinary things, the way she must have said it every morning of her life before she stopped. Gideon stood in the doorway. He didn't move. His face did something that Adeline from across the room could not fully see and was not meant to. Then he said, "Morning, Clara Bug." His voice was completely even. It cost him something to make it that way that Adeline suspected only she could tell. He went and got his coffee and went back to the forge. Adeline turned back to her students. "Let's begin," she said. The December meeting was set for a Thursday evening, and by Wednesday the whole town knew it. Not because anyone had formally announced it beyond the usual posted notice at the land office and the feed store, but because Red Hollow was the kind of place where the air itself seemed to carry certain information, where you could feel a thing building before it arrived. People who hadn't spoken to Adeline once since her arrival were suddenly finding reasons to be on the same block as the forge. The liveryman, who had been casually friendly toward Gideon in a way that didn't extend to acknowledging Adeline's existence, gave her a nod when she passed his door on Wednesday morning, the small, careful nod of a man who is watching which way something falls before he commits to a direction. Adeline noticed it all and said nothing about it. She had prepared her case with the same methodical attention she brought to everything else. Documentation organized by date, the letter from Hale on top, then the reference from Castleton, then the Millbrook Board statement, then her original certificate with the county seal. She had also written a brief statement, 3 paragraphs, nothing florid, addressing the school charter question directly, citing the specific county ordinance language, and explaining how the workshop arrangement fell within the bounds of private instruction. It was careful work. She was proud of it in the way you're proud of something you built under pressure that holds its shape. Whether the board would read it carefully was another question entirely. She didn't sleep well Wednesday night. She was aware of Gideon moving around the house below her later than usual, the distinct pattern of his boots, the sound of a chair pulled back from the kitchen table, the soft clank of the coffee pot. She thought about going down. She didn't. She lay on her back looking at the ceiling and went over her statement again in her head, turning it the way you turn something before putting it away, making sure all the edges were where she expected them. Thursday morning, the children came to lessons as usual, and Adeline taught as usual, and she was careful to treat the day as a day rather than an event. If the children noticed that she was moving through the hours with a certain controlled deliberateness, they didn't say so. Owen had gotten through most of his arithmetic without prompting, which he announced at the end of the lesson with the tone of someone reporting a personal achievement of historical significance. Clara sat beside him and added gravely, "He only asked me twice." "That's an improvement," Adeline said. Owen's expression suggested he disputed the characterization, but had chosen this particular moment not to argue. By 4 in the afternoon, the lessons were done, the children had gone, and the workshop was quiet. Adeline came down to find the kitchen empty and sat at the table with her documentation folder and went through it one more time, not because it would change anything, but because the act of going through it settled her hands. Gideon came in from the forge. He'd clearly cleaned up. His hands were washed, his work shirt replaced with the one he wore when he went into town on business. He was running a hand through his still damp hair in the way of a man who has made an attempt at looking presentable and has arrived at the outer limits of what that effort can accomplish. He saw her at the table and stopped. "You eat?" he said. "Not yet." He pulled a pot onto the stove without comment and started the fire underneath it. She watched him move around the kitchen, finding bread, locating cheese, not asking whether she wanted these things, and thought about all the small ways this house had become familiar to her in 2 months. The particular squeak of the second floorboard, the way the kitchen window stuck in its frame when the temperature dropped, the fact that Gideon kept the salt on the wrong side of the stove and she had stopped trying to correct it. "Are you nervous?" she said. He glanced at her. "About tonight?" "Yes." He thought about it with the seriousness he brought to everything. "No," he said. "I know what I'm going to say. Either they'll hear it or they won't." "What are you going to say?" she asked. He set 2 plates on the table and sat down across from her. He looked at the documentation folder between them for a moment, then up at her. "The truth," he said. "The specific truth, not the general kind." She waited. "Owen couldn't read," he said. Not couldn't as in slow, couldn't as in he'd sit with a book and get halfway through a sentence and just stop. Like a wall came up. I watched him do it for 2 years. 2 years of teachers telling me he'd catch up, he'd grow into it. Some children just take longer. He paused. In 6 weeks with you, he read his mother's handwriting. Not all of it, not perfectly, but her words. He understood what she wrote. He stopped. Nobody's going to argue with that. They can argue with your certificate and your departure from Millbrook, and whether you're a suitable woman to live where you live, but they can't argue with the fact of what happened to my son. She looked at him. She felt something she didn't entirely have language for, a kind of gratitude that was too complicated to be just gratitude mixed with something that made her careful about how long she held his gaze. "And Clara?" she said. Something shifted in his face. "I'm going to tell them about Tuesday morning." She nodded once. They ate, mostly in silence, in the particular comfortable silence of people who have been in the same house long enough to not need noise. Vera Holst arrived at 5:30, as she'd told Adeline she would, to sit with the children. She came in with a covered dish, looked between Adeline and Gideon without saying anything transparent about what she was thinking, and told them to go. The meeting hall was full when they arrived. Fuller than the first meeting, which surprised Adeline and then stopped surprising her when she thought about it. In a town this small, a public board meeting was the closest thing to community theater that the winter offered, and this one had better stakes than most. She and Gideon took seats separately, Not by plan, but because the room's current pushed them that way. He went toward the center benches where the working men tended to sit. She went to the side near the wall where she could see the board table clearly. She recognized most of the faces around her now. 2 months in a town puts names to faces you wouldn't have known how to read before. Price opened the meeting with the formal language of official proceedings, and Adeline listened to the structure of it the way she listened to anything complicated, following the framework beneath the words. The board had received her documentation. The board had a number of concerns. The county had received a complaint regarding unlicensed school operation. There would be an opportunity for public comment. Margaret Tillis spoke first. She had that quality of a person who had prepared so thoroughly that the preparation was itself part of the performance. Every word placed, every pause timed, every piece of language chosen to sound reasonable while doing something else entirely. She cited the county ordinance about unlicensed schools. She cited the Millbrook departure. She cited, with a particular care that told Adeline she had thought about this one longest, the impropriety of a woman of uncertain professional standing residing in the household of a widowed man with impressionable children. She said impressionable children, the way you say a phrase you've rehearsed. She sat down to the sound of several people shifting and murmuring, which could have meant agreement or discomfort. Both produced the same noise. Price opened the floor to public comment. Vera Holst stood up from the third bench on the left side without waiting to be recognized. "My name is Vera Holst," she said, loud enough that no one could pretend not to hear. "I've lived on the Ridge Road for 26 years. My grandson Martin has been attending Miss Mercer's lessons for 3 weeks. She looked at the board. "He can do long division. He couldn't 3 weeks ago. That's the whole of what I have to say." She sat down. A man near the back, Adeline recognized him as Judith's father, the mill worker, stood up. "My daughter's 9. She was bored out of her skin in that schoolhouse. Miss Mercer gave her material 2 grade levels ahead. She's doing it." He sat down without ceremony. Harriet Frome stood up. "My daughter Bess was behind in reading. She's not behind anymore." Each speaker was short. None of them were making speeches. They were reporting facts, the way Gideon had said it, specific truths rather than general ones. And the room had a different quality than it had 2 months ago, the first night, when the current had all been moving in one direction. Price looked mildly alarmed. He had clearly not anticipated this volume of comment. Then Gideon stood up. The room settled in a particular way when he did. He was not a man who drew attention to himself ordinarily, and so when he chose to take up space in a public way, people noticed it. He stood with his hands at his sides and looked at the board table and did not look at Adeline. "My name is Gideon Ashcroft," he said. "My forge is on Main Street. I've been here 12 years. Price nodded. "Mr. Ashcroft." "My wife died 18 months ago," Gideon said. "Her name was Ruth. My son Owen is 9. After she died, he stopped being able to read. He'd been learning, he was making progress, and then she was gone and the reading went with her somehow. 2 years of trying to get it back." He paused. Not for effect. He wasn't built for performance. He paused because what he was about to say required care. 6 weeks after Miss Mercer came into my house, he said, my son read his mother's handwriting. She had written him a letter before she got sick, stored it away for when he was older. He's been wanting to read it since she died. He couldn't, and then he could. He looked at the board, not at Price specifically, at all of them. "I don't know how to weigh that against whatever it is you're trying to weigh it against. I'm not a school board. I don't know about county ordinances and professional references. What I know is that a woman came to this town under honest terms, was treated dishonestly on her first night here, and then went ahead and did the work anyway. And the work is..." He stopped himself before the word he was about to use. Started again. "It's real. What she does is real. My son is different than he was." A beat. Then, steadier. "My daughter spoke this week. She hadn't spoken in 18 months. She said morning, Papa." His jaw shifted almost imperceptibly. "I'm not saying Miss Mercer cured her. I'm saying my daughter lives in a house where learning is happening and children are being taken seriously, and 2 days ago she had something she wanted to say enough to say it." He looked at the board again. I don't think the women of this town who've been sending their children to my workshop are confused about what they're choosing. I think they're choosing the better education for their children, and I think this board needs to decide whether it's going to let a personal campaign override the interests of the children of this town. He sat down. The room was different after that. Not unanimous. She could see it, the faces that had closed rather than opened, the two board members who were looking at the table. But different. Something had shifted in the weight of the room. Then Tillis stood up again. "With respect to Mr. Ashcroft," she said, and her voice had something in it that was almost gentle, which was worse than when it wasn't. A father's affection for a woman who has made herself indispensable to his household is not the same as professional qualification. It's exactly what the board should be concerned about. Murmur in the room. "She's living in his house," Tillis said. "She manages his finances. She has made herself central to his children's lives. What this board is being asked to approve is not simply a teaching appointment, it is the formal endorsement of an arrangement that has, from the beginning, been irregular at best." Adeline stood up. She hadn't planned to speak from the floor. She'd planned to speak only if called on directly, but she was on her feet before she'd decided to be, and the room turned to look at her, and she thought, "All right then." "Mrs. Tillis," she said, "has made two categories of argument tonight. The first concerns my professional qualifications, which I've documented thoroughly and which the board has had for 3 weeks. If those documents are insufficient, I'd like to know specifically what is missing." She looked at Price. "Specifically." Price opened his mouth, then closed it. "The second category," she said, "concerns my personal living arrangement, which she has characterized repeatedly as irregular. I'd like to be precise about what that means. I rent a room. I am paid for teaching. The financial arrangement is documented and clean." She paused. "What Mrs. Tillis is actually suggesting, and I think we can say it plainly, is that an unmarried woman cannot live in proximity to a widower without the nature of that arrangement becoming suspect. That is not a professional concern. That is a personal one, and it is being used in place of a professional argument because there isn't one strong enough to carry the case on its own." Tillis's expression didn't change. "I'm raising the question the board has an obligation to raise." "Then raise it plainly," Adeline said. "Don't dress it as a concern for the children." The room made a sound that wasn't quite a gasp and wasn't quite approval, something in between. Price cleared his throat. "The board will recess to deliberate." The 5 board members filed through the door at the back of the hall. The room broke into the particular noise of people released from enforced quiet, voices rising and then moderating as people remembered they were still in public. Adeline sat back down. Her hands were steady. Her heart was not. Across the room, she saw Gideon. He was looking at her. He didn't nod or gesture or do anything readable. He just looked at her the way he had from the beginning, the steady, direct way that she had initially found difficult to interpret and had since come to understand was simply what attention looked like on him, complete and unperforming. She looked back at him for a moment, then away. Vera appeared beside her, having navigated from the third bench with her characteristic lack of ceremony. "You said it right," Vera said quietly. "All of it." "We'll see what they decide," Adeline said. "Yes, we will," Vera said. She paused. "Gideon hasn't stood up in a public meeting since Ruth's funeral, when he read the scripture." A pause. "He stood up for her then, stood up for you now." She said it without editorializing, the way she said most things. Adeline absorbed this and didn't respond. The deliberation took 40 minutes, which was long enough to make the room restless, and short enough to indicate they'd moved relatively quickly once the arguing started. When the board filed back in, Adeline read the faces. 2 members neutral, 1 barely containing satisfaction, 1 visibly uncomfortable, and Price with the expression of a man who has been told what to say and is marshaling himself to say it. He stood. "The board has reviewed the documentation," he said. "The professional qualifications are... The documentation is adequate." A pause on adequate that told her there had been a fight over the word. "There remain concerns about the operating arrangement, the informal school at the smithy, and the county ordinance question. I'm prepared to apply for a charter." Adeline said from her seat. Price looked at her. A charter application would require a permanent location, a registered instructor, and evidence of curriculum, she said. I have all three. I can submit the application by the end of the month. One of the board members, a man named Garrett, who she'd never spoken to but who had been looking progressively more uncomfortable since Gideon's statement, said, if the qualifications are adequate and she's prepared to file for a charter, I don't see what we're deliberating. Tillis, from her seat now, said, the question of her living arrangement is not before this board, Garrett said, with the bluntness of a man who has made up his mind. Her certificate is before this board. Price looked at Tillis, then at Garrett, then at the other three members. He looked like a man standing between two weather systems trying to determine which one was stronger. The board will vote, he said. 3 in favor, 1 against. Price, after a pause that stretched 5 full seconds, said, aye. 4-1. The appointment confirmed. The room's reaction was layered, not a single sound but several overlapping ones, approval from some sections, silence from others, and from near the front, the particular silence of Margaret Tillis accepting an outcome she had not arranged. Adeline sat very still for a moment. She pressed her hands flat on her thighs the way she had done on the night she arrived, and she breathed in slowly, and she let herself feel it. Not triumph, which was the wrong word and the wrong shape, but something closer to solid ground after a long time on uncertain footing. People began to move around her. Several came to speak to her. Garrett stopped to introduce himself properly. Harriet Frome squeezed her arm. Vera Holst patted her shoulder once, firmly, the way you pat someone when you're actually saying there, that's done. She responded to all of them, shook hands, thanked people, kept her face composed. Tillis left without speaking to her. Adeline watched her go with a complicated feeling, not satisfaction, not quite. Something more like the awareness of an unfinished conversation that would probably never be finished and had to be left that way. Outside, the air had gone sharp and cold, a thin skin of ice on the puddles from the day's earlier thaw. People were filing out around her, their breath clouding in the lantern light. Gideon appeared beside her without announcement, the way he usually did. They walked toward the forge without speaking for half a block. Their breath made the same kind of cloud in the cold air. 4-1, she said. I heard, he said. Price voted with the majority. He would, once it was safe to. She thought about that. You knew he'd do that. I've watched him for 12 years, Gideon said. He goes where it's safe. Once Garrett voted yes, it was safe. They walked another half block. What you said in there, she said. About Owen. About Clara. He didn't answer immediately. He had his hands in his coat pockets, and he was looking at the street ahead. It's what happened, he said. I just said what happened. You didn't have to. I know, he said. I wanted to. She looked at him briefly. He was looking at the street. His jaw had that quality she'd come to recognize, controlled, not suppressed, a distinction she'd taken some time to understand about him. I don't know if it made the difference, she said. It made the difference to me, he said. Whether it changed any votes, maybe. But that's not why I said it. He paused. I said it because it was true. And because I was tired of sitting in a building full of people arguing about you like you weren't there, like you were a problem to be solved instead of a... He stopped. Instead of a what? She said. He looked at her then, directly, with the complete and unperforming attention she'd gotten used to. Instead of a person doing good work, he said, in my house, with my children. She held his gaze for a moment. The cold was sharp on her face. The schoolhouse, she said finally. I need to look at it before Monday, see what it needs. I'll go with you, he said. Saturday, if you want. I have to fix the bell mount anyway. It's been loose since October. She hadn't known that. The bell doesn't ring? It rings, but the mount is cracked. One bad wind and the whole thing comes down. He said it practically, the way he said practical things. I was going to leave it until spring. I'll do it Saturday. They reached the forge. He stopped at the door and looked up at the windows above. At her room, the east-facing window dark now. The children are going to want to know what happened, he said. They'll be asleep. Owen will be awake, he said. He won't sleep until I come home. She smiled at that, a real one, the kind she didn't always intend to show. Tell him I'll explain the whole thing in the morning. He looked at her. You should tell him, he said. He'll want to hear it from you. She thought about Owen at the table in the kitchen, turning letters over in his head until they stopped being walls and started being doors. She thought about Clara with her hand up, asking to share a slate. She thought about the east-facing window in her room, cold in the mornings, the sound of the forge starting up below her, the smell of coffee before anyone had spoken. All right, she said. Tell him I'll come down. She went up the exterior stairs, unlocked her door, set down her satchel, stood at the window for a moment looking out at the street where the last of the meeting's attendees were dispersing in ones and twos, their lanterns moving away into the dark. The appointment was confirmed. The charter application needed filing. The schoolhouse needed assessment. There was work to be done. There was always work to be done. And the doing of it was the thing she was good at, and the thing that, when she was honest about it, she did not want to stop. She changed out of her good dress and went back downstairs. Owen was at the kitchen table with a book open in front of him, sitting with the extremely casual posture of a child who has been waiting and needs you to believe he wasn't. He looked up when she came in. Well, he said. She sat down across from him. 4 votes to 1, she said. The appointment is confirmed. He absorbed this with the seriousness he brought to information he considered important. Then he said, So you're the schoolteacher now. I'm the schoolteacher, she said. Officially. He looked down at his book. Back up. Does that mean you're leaving the forge? She looked at him. At the book open in front of him, his finger still on the line he'd been reading when she came in. At the cloth rabbit on the chair beside him. Clara had left it, probably accidentally, maybe not. Not yet, she said. There are things to sort out. The schoolhouse needs work, and... She stopped. And what? He said. And I still need to finish your father's account books, she said. They're only half done. He looked at her for another moment. Then he turned back to his book with the focused expression of a child returning to something that matters. Okay, he said. And then, without looking up, I'm glad. She sat with him for a while in the warm kitchen while the forge cooled below and the town outside settled into winter dark. And she didn't say anything else, and neither did he. And it was the kind of quiet that meant something had been decided, even if neither of them had found all the words for it yet. The Saturday after the board meeting, Gideon fixed the bell mount. Adeline stood in the schoolhouse yard and watched him work from below, handing up tools when he asked for them, which he did with the economical precision of a man who knew exactly what he needed and in what order. The crack in the iron mount was worse than she'd expected. A clean split along the base, probably from last spring's freeze and thaw cycle working against metal that had been under stress too long. He'd brought a replacement bracket from the forge, forged it himself the previous afternoon, and the fit when he seated it was exact enough that it made a particular sound, the quiet authority of something placed correctly. The bell itself was heavier than it looked. When he lowered it back onto the new mount and tightened the bolts, he gave the rope one pull to test the swing, and the sound that came out of it rang across the empty yard and down the street, and hung in the cold air for a moment before fading. Adeline stood in the yard with a tool bag at her feet and listened to it. She had not let herself think too carefully about what the sound of that bell meant, about what it would mean on a Monday morning, ringing for children who would come through a door she was permitted to open. She'd been too careful about her own hoping for too long. Hope of a certain size had been something she rationed since her father died, the way you ration things in lean seasons, enough to keep going, not so much that losing it would stop you, but standing in the schoolhouse yard listening to the bell, she let herself feel it for a moment without rationing. It'll hold, Gideon said, coming down the ladder. Good, she said. He picked up the tool bag. He looked at the schoolhouse door, then at her. You want to go inside? See what it needs? She had the key from Price given to her the morning after the vote with the wooden expression of a man handing over something he hadn't expected to hand over. She unlocked the door. The schoolhouse was cold and dim and smelled of chalk dust and closed winter air. 2 rows of desks, smaller ones at the front, larger at the back. A slate board that needed cleaning. A wood stove at the front that Gideon crouched in front of and opened and examined, pressing his hand against the interior before closing it again. "Flue's clear," he said. "Someone closed it up right before winter." She walked the rows of desks slowly, the way she always walked a new room, measuring it with her feet, getting a sense of how it breathed, where the light fell, where the cold air pooled. The east windows were good. The south wall had a damp patch near the floor that would need watching. The slates on several desks were cracked and needed replacing, and someone had left a pile of readers on the back shelf that were 3 editions old. She stood at the front, behind the teacher's desk, and looked at the room. Gideon was leaning against the doorframe, hands in his coat pockets, watching her. "What are you thinking?" he said. "I'm thinking I need new slates for at least 4 desks," she said, "and the damp in the south wall needs to be addressed before it moves up, and—" She stopped. "And what?" "And I don't want to give up the morning lessons at the forge," she said. He was quiet for a moment. "You could do both," he said. "Schoolhouse in the morning for the enrolled students, forge in the afternoon for anyone who needs extra work." "That's a long day." "You already work a long day." She looked at him. He was being practical about it, the way he was practical about everything, and she thought that this was one of the things she had come to trust about him, that he didn't dress things as more than they were or less than they were. And when he offered a solution, it was because he'd actually thought about it, not because he wanted to say something reassuring. "I'll think about it," she said. "Take the time you need," he said. "The forge isn't going anywhere." She looked back at the room, at the rows of desks that had been empty for too long. She thought about the workshop, the plank tables and the mismatched chairs, and the slate board Gideon had mounted on the east wall without announcement. She thought about what it had felt like to teach in there, constrained and improvised and somehow more alive than any formally appointed classroom she'd worked in. She thought about what that told her. Not that institutions didn't matter, because they did, because this building and the board stamp of approval and the charter she'd filed before the month was out were all real forms of protection that a woman in her position needed and could not pretend to be above. But that the building wasn't the thing. It never had been. The thing was the work, and the work happened wherever you did it faithfully enough. She locked the schoolhouse on her way out and put the key in her coat pocket where she could feel its weight. They walked back to the forge together in the cold, not hurrying. The main street was quiet on a Saturday afternoon. A few wagons, a couple of people going in and out of the dry goods store. Mrs. Patton, whose daughter Nora told everyone everything, passed them on the opposite sidewalk and gave a brief nod that was more than she'd offered before. Not warmth, not exactly, but something in the direction of it. Adeline nodded back. "Progress," Gideon said quietly, beside her. "Barely," she said. "Progress," he said again, with the same tone. She almost smiled. The month of December moved differently than the months before it. There was still the daily work, the morning lessons, the account books, the schoolhouse assessment, and the charter application she filed on the 18th, which Price countersigned with the expression of a man completing a transaction he'd already accepted as inevitable. There was still the cold and the short days and the particular exhaustion of a woman doing more than one person's work in a season when everything required more effort than usual. But something had settled. Not finished. She was practical enough to know that Margaret Tillis hadn't decided to let it go, that the women at the pump still had their opinions, that her position in Red Hollow was recently won, and therefore still fragile in the ways that recently won things always were. But settled, the way a house settles into its foundation over time. You can still feel the unevenness underfoot, but the major shifting is done. Owen finished the River Raft book in the second week of December, reading the last 3 pages aloud to Clara and Adeline at the kitchen table after dinner, slowly, carefully, his finger under each line. When he reached the final page, he read to the end without stopping and then closed the book and put it flat on the table and sat with his hands on top of it. "Good ending," he said. "It is," Adeline agreed. "The boy gets home," he said, "but he's different than when he left." "That usually happens," she said. He looked at the book. "Miss Mercer." "Yes." "My mom's letters," he said. "The ones I haven't read yet, the longer ones." He kept his eyes on the book cover. I think I'm ready for the next one. She looked at him. At the angle of his shoulders, the careful way he was holding himself still. I think you are too, she said. They read the next letter that Saturday. It was 3 pages, Ruth's handwriting small and close, and there were words in it that stopped Owen and required sounding out. And once they stopped for nearly 4 minutes over a word that turned out to be persevere, which Adeline explained and which Owen repeated twice to himself and then said, she would have used a word like that. He said it with a kind of recognition, not grief, not exactly, but the intimacy of knowing someone's habits. The particular way you know a person when you've lived with them long enough to recognize their language. She would, Gideon said. He was in the kitchen when they read it, at the counter with his coffee, not joining the reading but not leaving either, occupying the space in the background the way he sometimes did now, present without intruding, there in case he was needed. Adeline looked at him briefly. He was looking at his coffee. He had been different since the board meeting. Not in any dramatic way. He was still Gideon, still quiet and self-contained and practical about everything. But something had been released in him when he stood up in that hall and said the specific truth plainly, and she could feel it in the way the house carried itself. Some pressure that had been held without his quite knowing it, now gone. She was aware that she had feelings about this. She had been aware of it for some weeks, actually, aware in the way you're aware of something you're not ready to look at directly. The peripheral awareness that tells you something is there without committing to what it is. She was 31 years old. She had been practical about her life since her mother died when she was 12, and practical had become necessary. She had learned to value what was real over what was hoped for, and what could be built through work over what arrived through feeling. These were not things she regretted. They had carried her through a great deal, but she had also been, if she was honest, lonely in a way she'd mostly stopped thinking about. Not the acute loneliness of being among people who disliked you. She'd had that in quantity since arriving in Red Hollow, and it was a known quantity, unpleasant but manageable. The other kind. The long kind. The kind that accumulates so gradually that you stop noticing it until something changes and you feel the contrast. The contrast these days felt very clear. Clara came to sit beside Adeline on the bench while Owen finished reading, pressing herself close the way she had begun to do recently, a habit of proximity that had developed gradually since she'd started speaking again. She did not need to be touching anyone, exactly. She would sit 2 inches away and that was enough for her. Adeline had learned not to make a fuss about it, which was what Clara clearly preferred. When Owen finishes, Clara said quietly, "Can I hear a different letter?" "A different letter?" "One Mama wrote to me," she said. "Papa said there are some. One she wrote before she got sick when I was a baby. Things she wanted to tell me." Adeline looked at Gideon over Clara's head. He was looking at his daughter with an expression that had something raw in it and something resolved, the expression of a man who had decided to stop protecting his children from the fact of loss and start helping them carry it instead. "We'll find them after Owen's done," Adeline said to Clara. Clara nodded and settled against her side and returned her attention to her brother's reading. Christmas came and passed quietly. Vera brought food. The children got small gifts that Gideon had made himself in the evenings. Owen got a proper reading slate with his name scratched into the wood backing. Clara got a small painted box for her important things. Adeline had made them each something too, small things, careful. Gideon had given her without ceremony a new teaching notebook, leather bound, her initials pressed into the cover, and she had held it longer than was probably obvious, and thanked him in a voice she kept even with some effort. It was the most domestic Christmas she'd had in years. She did not know what to do with that exactly, so she did what she usually did with things she didn't know what to do with. She sat with it and let it be what it was. The new year brought the schoolhouse. She opened it on the second Monday of January, and the bell rang for the first time in months, and 11 children came through the door in their winter coats and filled the rows of desks, and the schoolhouse ceased to be an empty building that had been used against her as a symbol, and became simply a room full of children who needed to learn things, which was all it had ever been meant to be. She kept the afternoon sessions at the forge. She had decided that while she stood in the schoolhouse yard listening to the repaired bell, the morning was the institution, the enrolled classes, the formal curriculum, the structure that the county required and that the children needed. The afternoon was the other thing, the room where Martin did his long division and Bess read ahead, and Judith worked through problems that Adeline had to go back into her own memory to recall. Different in shape from the morning, but not lesser. Both necessary. Gideon banked the forge at noon on school days and moved the afternoon's work to later, arranging his hours around the children's schedule with the same quiet practicality he brought to everything, as though this had always been the plan. It was in February that things became clear, if she was honest with herself. Not happened, but became clear, because she thought they had been happening for longer than she wanted to admit. She had been working late on a Thursday evening, at the kitchen table with the account books, the forge long quiet below, and the children in bed, when she heard Gideon's boots on the stairs from the workshop, and he came into the kitchen with a look on his face that she had come to identify as, "I've been thinking about something, and I'm going to say it." He poured coffee. He sat down across from her. He looked at the account books between them. "Almost finished?" he said. "2 more columns," she said. He looked at them. A pause. "Adeline," he said. She looked up. He used her first name so rarely that when he did, it had a particular weight. "I want to ask you something," he said, "and I want you to hear it as a real question, not as something that creates an obligation, because I mean it as real." She closed the account book. "Okay," she said. He looked at his coffee cup. I'm not good at this kind of thing. She was better at it, at saying the complicated things." He stopped. "But I think you should know where I stand, because I think you should be able to make an informed decision about what you want, and that requires me to say something clearly instead of just doing things around the edges of it." She was very still. "I would like to ask you," he said, whether you'd want to." He looked at her. "I'm not asking because you live here and it would be convenient. I'm not asking because the children love you, even though they do. And you should know that. I'm asking because He stopped again. He was a man who found the precise language for things when it was technical, when it was practical, when it was about what was real and what could be measured. He was less at ease in this particular territory. "I'm asking because I think about you specifically, not as the teacher in my house or the woman who fixed my accounts. You, specifically. And I think I have been for a while." He looked at her directly. "So I'm asking whether there's any chance you feel whether this is..." He exhaled. "I'm not good at this." "You're doing fine," she said. Her voice was quiet. Do you..." He tried once more. Yes or no would help. She looked at him, at the hands that had carried her trunk up a dark staircase on her worst night, and built hooks for children's coats without announcing it, and repaired the schoolhouse bell in the cold, and sat across from her at this table for months, in the kind of easy silence that takes a long time to build between people. She thought about what she'd come here for, what she'd told herself she came for. A position, a beginning, a chance to be useful and competent and left to do her work without interference. She had gotten all of that. She had fought for it and earned it, and it was real, and it was hers. And sitting at this table, in this kitchen, in this house, that had become, without her fully noticing when, the place she oriented toward at the end of every day, she thought that the wanting she had rationed for so long had quietly made up its own mind while she was busy with other things. "Yes," she said. He looked at her. "Yes, Yes," she said again, "to the question you were working toward." He sat with that for a moment. Something in his face did what it rarely did, let go of its usual careful hold, and became, briefly, simply what it was. Not a performance of feeling, just the feeling. "Okay," he said. "Okay," she said. They sat at the table for another hour while she finished the account books, and he drank his coffee and read through the supply list for a job he had coming the following week. And neither of them said anything that was particularly remarkable, and it was, Adeline thought, exactly the way she would have wanted it to happen. Not a scene, not a performance, just 2 people in a kitchen deciding something real. They were married in April, on a Saturday when the hills to the north were going green and the mud had finally dried enough that the main street of Red Hollow was passable without losing a boot in it. It was a small affair by design. Vera stood witness. Owen wore the shirt he'd been told 3 times not to grow out of, and had grown out of anyway. and Clara had her rabbit in her pocket and her dark hair in braids that she had asked Adeline to do that morning, sitting on the edge of the bed with the patience of a child who has decided to trust something entirely. The town came anyway. Not all of it. Red Hollow was not a town that moved as a single unit on any question, but enough of it. Harriet Frome, Judith's father from the mill, Martin and his mother, the Garrett family, the board member who had voted first for Adeline, even Mrs. Patton, who arrived late and stood at the back and clapped with everyone else at the end. Margaret Tillis was not there. No one mentioned her absence. Vera, standing beside Adeline before the ceremony started, said, "She'll come around or she won't. Either way, you don't need her to." "I know," Adeline said. "Good," Vera said. "Stop fidgeting with your cuffs." After, there was food at the forge and the schoolhouse yard both. Vera had organized this with a military efficiency she would deny if asked, and children ran between the two buildings with the particular freedom of children who have been told they can have the afternoon and intend to use every minute of it. Owen found Adeline at the edge of the yard, away from the main noise for a moment. He had cake on his shirt, which would have been more of an issue on any other day. "Miss Mercer," he said. Then he stopped. "I mean, what do I call you now?" She looked at him. He was taller than he'd been in September. His shoulders had a new set to them, the slight squaring of a boy who had been carrying his uncertainty more quietly lately. "What do you want to call me?" she said. He thought about it with the seriousness he brought to things that mattered. "Can I still call you Miss Mercer? At school?" "At school, yes," she said. "And at home?" She looked at him for a moment. "What feels right?" she said. He thought. Then, "I'll figure it out," he said. "I'll know when I know." "That's reasonable," she said. He nodded, satisfied, and went back toward the forge where Martin had found some scrap iron that he was examining with intense interest and no good reason. Owen broke into a run. Clara came and stood beside her, rabbit in hand, looking out at the yard. "Owen doesn't know what to call you," Clara said. "I heard," Adeline said. "I know what I'll call you," Clara said. Adeline looked down at her. Clara was looking at the yard with the calm of a 6-year-old who has decided something and considers it settled. "What will you call me?" Adeline said. Clara looked up at her with Ruth's dark eyes and Gideon's face, the particular combination that sometimes made Adeline catch herself with a feeling she hadn't expected. "Mama Adeline," Clara said, as if it were obvious, as if it had always been the answer and she'd just been waiting for the right moment to say it. She held the rabbit out briefly, the way she sometimes did, offering it for a moment, a gesture that meant something only Clara fully understood, then tucked it back under her arm and went off across the yard at a run. Adeline stood at the edge of the schoolhouse yard and breathed. She had come to Red Hollow with a trunk, a satchel, a folder of documents, and the intention of beginning again. She had known, in an abstract way, what beginning again required, the willingness to start from nothing, to be unknown, to do the work without the benefit of established reputation or trust. She had thought she was prepared for that. She had not been prepared for the specific ways that starting from nothing could also mean being set upon, reduced, accused of things that were untrue by people who found her inconvenient. She had not been prepared for the exhaustion of having to prove basic facts about her own character to people who had already made up their minds. She had not been prepared for the particular loneliness of doing everything right and having that count for nothing in rooms where the decision had already been made. But here was what she had learned, what this town and these months and this strange, sideways, unplanned life had taught her. That the people who come at you with accusations are usually threatened, and what they're threatened by is the thing in you that's real. Tillis had not come after her because she was unqualified. She'd come after her because she was capable, and that capability was visible. And visibility in a place where someone else holds the authority is always going to produce friction. The friction wasn't evidence that she was wrong. It was evidence that she was there. And that staying, not fleeing to Ferris Point, not accepting the graceful removals that had been offered at every stage, was its own form of argument. Not a speech, not a confrontation, just staying and doing the work, and letting the work be what it was. The schoolhouse bell was visible from where she stood, the new mount catching the afternoon light. She thought about the sound of it on Monday mornings, How the children had started running toward it rather than walking. This small thing she'd noticed in February, the shift from obligation to habit to something closer to desire, the particular gift of a classroom that a child has decided to belong to. She thought about Owen reading his mother's handwriting, the patience that had required from both of them, the slowness of it, the stumbles, the moments when the wall came up and they had to find a different way around. She had not fixed him. She had not healed him. She had just stayed in the room and kept working and let him find his own way to the page, which was the only teaching that actually held. She thought about Clara saying morning, Papa, in a voice rough with disuse, and how the whole house had held its breath and then breathed again. She thought about Gideon at the kitchen table saying yes or no would help, and how she had understood in that moment that the plainness was the love, that a man who had learned to dress everything in practical language was telling her something enormous in the only language he'd ever been completely comfortable with. People who lose things, she had lost her mother young, her father slowly, the assumption of a stable professional life in one public meeting. People who lose things develop one of two habits. They hold what remains so tightly that it stops being able to breathe, or they learn to hold things differently, with the kind of grip that allows for movement and growth without releasing the thing entirely. She had been working on the second way for most of her adult life. She was not always good at it. She was better than she used to be. Gideon appeared beside her. He had a piece of cake on a plate that he held out to her, and she took it, and they stood side by side at the edge of the yard in the April afternoon watching Owen and Martin discover what happened when you introduce scrap iron to a child's unsupervised curiosity. "We should probably stop them," Adeline said. "Probably," Gideon agreed. Neither of them moved. She looked out at the yard, at the children running, at Vera holding court near the food table, at the schoolhouse with its repaired bell and its clean slates and its rows of desks that would be full on Monday, and she thought that this was what it looked like when a beginning had finished being a beginning and become simply a life. Imperfect in all the ways lives are imperfect, full of things that would still require work, things she hadn't figured out yet, things that would not resolve the way she planned, but full, genuinely full, of the kind of weight that means something is real. She ate the cake. It was good. Vera had made it, and Vera's cooking was one of the unambiguous goods of Red Hollow. "The account books," she said. "Finished," he said. "I saw." "You owe Hendrik 60 cents, she said. I left a note. "I'll take care of it Monday." "You said that in November." "I mean it more now," he said. She looked at him. He looked back at her with that straight, complete attention, and she thought, there it is again, and now I don't have to pretend I don't know what it means. 60 cents, she said. "Monday." "Monday?" he said. Owen had climbed onto the split-rail fence at the edge of the yard. He was balanced on it with his arms out, which was going to end one specific way. Gideon said, "Owen," in the exact tone of a man who has said this same word in the same tone several thousand times and expects to say it several thousand more. Owen fell off the fence, landed in the dirt, sat up, checked for damage, and grinned. "I'm fine," he announced. Adeline handed her plate to Gideon and went to help Owen up, brushing the dirt from his shoulder, examining the tear she'd known would be in the knee of his trousers, which he would be embarrassed about for approximately 40 seconds before forgetting entirely. He was 9 years old, and recently the kind of happy that had been a long time coming, and the trousers could be mended. She had mended things before. She was good at it, and some things, she had come to understand this slowly over the course of one ordinary and extraordinary year in a frontier town that had tried to be done with her before she'd unpacked. Some things, when mended well, held stronger at the break than they ever had before. The bell was still. The yard was full. The afternoon light was the long, particular gold of early spring, the kind that makes everything look like it's been there forever. It hadn't been. But it was here now, and she intended to keep it.